Hey everybody, it's Minius, and this is a follow-up to a video I did a little over a week ago called Mass Effect Andromeda Multiplayer is Coming. And it is. You can check out that video whenever, there's a link in the description box. It contains what we know about multiplayer in Andromeda, which is a lot, surprisingly, given how little we know about the game overall. But this video is about the future of Mass Effect multiplayer, specifically about things that we don't know and where the series can go from here, which is pretty far. But before we can get too far, the multiplayer in Mass Effect Andromeda needs to be successful. Fortunately, there's a really good blueprint on how to do that, Mass Effect 3's multiplayer, and according to developer quotes and that big Reddit leak, they appear to be following that blueprint. Basically, the success of the multiplayer will hinge on just a few things. Firstly, the combat needs to be fun. That's not too obvious, is it?
Spoken well.
If they don't stray too much from the combat in Mass Effect 3, this isn't going to be an issue. But if the combat in Andromeda isn't fun, this new game has much bigger problems than the multiplayer. Secondly, and probably most importantly, as far as the multiplayer is concerned, there needs to be a variety of playstyles supported. This was the biggest strength of the multiplayer in Mass Effect 3, and they achieved this through a bunch of different playable characters with very distinct abilities and feels. So fun combat and a bunch of different combat styles that you can change between, and you've got a successful Mass Effect multiplayer. Pretty much, that's it. Almost. Where Mass Effect 3's multiplayer really excelled was the support that it received. BioWare consistently came out with multiplayer packs with new guns, new maps, and most importantly, new and exciting characters. If the Andromeda multiplayer wants to be as successful, they'll have to do the same. But how will all those multiplayer DLC packs be supported? Because the Mass Effect 3 multiplayer DLC packs were free to download, and ultimately, nothing is completely free. New stuff has to be developed and created, and developers need money to do this. So I guess people must have bought enough of those random supply/equipment packs to keep the multiplayer developers running. They did come out with 5 separate DLC packs after all. But in general, those random supply/equipment packs weren't that popular. In fact, question number 5 in my 12 big questions heading into Mass Effect Andromeda was, how will gear be distributed in Mass Effect Andromeda multiplayer? That question was actually the original idea for this video, but I ran across a problem. I have no idea how gear will be distributed. I don't even know what qualifies as gear. Normally, I'd expect things to work very similar to the previous game. In this case, that's Mass Effect 3, where you had weapons of different qualities, 1 through 10, and specific characters that came in those packs, and other more minor equipment and consumables, but I'm not as confident things are going to work in the same way. Why am I so thrown? Well, most of this comes from that big Reddit leak I refer to all the time. In that leak, it says that there is crafting and crafting materials, and there's a chance this is going to be applied to the multiplayer. So does that mean you'll be going after materials that you can build weapons and equipment with? And maybe you'll need to acquire blueprints to make specific things, cause blueprints are also mentioned in that leak. Also, apparently, leg armor is upgradable and related to your jump pack. Does that mean that armor pieces are added in with the gear? Does it mean that all gear and equipment is upgradable? Do you need blueprints and crafting materials for armor as well? A tweet from BioWare developer Jas Hendricks, who is definitely worth a follow by the way if you're on Twitter, is also throwing me off. In a recent tweet he says, "Script in that loot, in space, no one can hear you loot, all the things." Now what does he mean by loot? Is that the classic RPG, MMORPG, Borderlands type loot? Or does that mean something else? There are just way too many unknowns when it comes to gear in Mass Effect Andromeda for me to speculate on. It's possible that I'm overthinking it, but guessing how gear is distributed is now damn near impossible, and therefore guessing how that can be monetized in the multiplayer is also damn near impossible. I know how I'd like things to work. I don't want it to be too easy for people to buy gear with actual money. Some of you have said you don't actually care about this, and if that's the case, good for you. I'm not being a jerk, I mean it. Good for you. Even though Mass Effect multiplayer is a cooperative experience, I can't help but get a little competitive. I want to score the highest. I want to work hard and get better gear and then show that gear off. I want gearing up to mean something, and I get a lot of enjoyment out of all of that. If there is a shortcut that allows people to bypass this, I'm going to enjoy myself less. Really, a lot less. And I won't be the only one.
But I approve.
The solution to this is probably pretty simple. Even if gear distribution works differently in Andromeda, and I kinda hope it does, purchases should be limited to those random gear packs. That means if you want to pay extra to make some extra gear headway, you can do so, but you won't be able to overpower those who like earning their gear in the natural way. If this financial model worked for Mass Effect 3, then it can work for Andromeda. They could even supplement that by allowing people to purchase cosmetic stuff, which a lot of the MOBAs do, and that wouldn't bother me at all. As I mentioned before though, I would like the way this gear is earned to be changed up a bit. I'd like to specifically go after certain items. Now, a lot of multiplayer games have an overall leveling system that grants you access to higher quality items as you level up, so that's an option, maybe. Perhaps you can acquire certain weapon and equipment licenses for sets of gear, and then use large chunks of multiplayer currency to purchase the specific item you want. If crafting comes into play, then I'd like to be able to go after specific materials to build the stuff I want, and this could be done by going after specific enemy types or playing on specific maps. Perhaps you can unlock items by achieving things, like killing 10,000 Ket to unlock the anti-douchebag rifle or something. As soon as we get actual information on how gear or loot or whatever is going to work, I'll get way into that with some videos. For now, your guess on how things will work is as good as mine, and it's certainly entirely possible that things will work in a very similar way to the way things worked in Mass Effect 3's multiplayer. But what about the further future of Mass Effect multiplayer? We know, at least to start, Andromeda multiplayer will be very, very similar in concept to the multiplayer in Mass Effect 3. However, I think Mass Effect multiplayer can be much bigger than that. First of all, I don't care at all if the multiplayer is tied to the single player. I don't even need the multiplayer to make sense, which is almost the exact opposite of my attitude towards the single player. Perhaps the best example of this is when the Mass Effect 3's multiplayer added collectors as an enemy type. This was awesome. It also made no sense. Mass Effect 2 should have wiped all of the collectors out. Now, if collectors were a major enemy type in Mass Effect 3, it really would have bothered me. But in the multiplayer, I was too busy having fun to even care. Let's try some hypothetical Andromeda examples. For instance, I don't think the Yogg are going to be in the new game. And no, I don't think that this dude is a Yogg. For me, it just doesn't make sense for the Yogg to be there. But if they showed up in the multiplayer, I'd love it. Picture a gang of Shadow Broker-like foes with a massive Omni Shield in one hand and an M76 Revenant in the other, and then have them enter the fray repeatedly. How awesome would that be? The correct answer, by the way, is very awesome. Or how about this? What if you could take on a Volus army? Perhaps some Volus-controlled gigantic mechs backed by an army of biotic gods. Yes, that makes no sense, but it sounds awesome. Ultimately, I don't know how realistic this is. BioWare seems to want the single player and the multiplayer to be connected in some way, which would make taking on a Volus army completely ridiculous. But maybe in the future, they won't feel this way. Let's try some more realistic future options, like gameplay modes. At least to start, Andromeda's multiplayer appears to be limited to the Horde mode we got in Mass Effect 3, meaning waves of enemies with a few objectives mixed in. This can be expanded on. We can start with something small, like instead of surviving a wave, you have to complete it in a certain amount of time by eliminating all of the enemies quickly. Or maybe something a little larger, like adding bosses, map-specific or otherwise, who are interesting and challenging to bring down. Or instead of just wave-based arena maps, how about end-to-end linear maps with objectives along the way? And if you want to get even more complicated, you can turn those maps into co-op story missions that get as complex and story-driven as you like. Combat in Mass Effect lends itself to all of these options and more. If you want some more ideas on how multiplayer in Mass Effect can be expanded, I suggest you check out the free-to-play game Warframe, which has things like map progression and community events. One thing that needs to be kept in mind though, as always, is that at its heart, Mass Effect is a single-player game. The multiplayer in Mass Effect 3 was pulled off because it wasn't very complex. It's really not that difficult to add a Horde mode. The more complicated the multiplayer gets, the more resources it takes to be made, and as much as I like Mass Effect's multiplayer, it shouldn't take resources away from the single-player campaign. Once that campaign's complete though, I'd like to see how far Mass Effect multiplayer can go. Anyway, thanks for listening to me ramble on about the multiplayer, and I apologize to those of you who aren't all that into that.
Really?
No, not really. I would though like those of you who weren't into the multiplayer the first time, or didn't even give it a shot, give it another try once Andromeda comes out. And if you like this video, please give it a like. It really helps out the channel. Keep an eye on MiniusGC for more Mass Effect videos. But for now...
I should go.
Ha ha ha!